Masterclass in our series. I really hope that you enjoyed our first masterclass with Richard Maud on diplomacy last week. I think he really kicked off the Emerging Leaders program in great style. And I am again zooming in from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm. And I'm recognizing that we are all zooming in from different traditional lands. So I thought you might like to extend your respect to elders past and present by putting into the chat box where you are zooming in from and the traditional lands from the clans from the lands upon which you are zooming in from. Sorry, I kind of messed that up a little bit. It's been a long day, but I'm really delighted to welcome our second speaker in our series of masterclasses, Professor Peter Dean, who is a military historian and one of Australia's very best thinkers on strategic and defence issues. So Peter is the chair of Defence Studies and director of the University of Western Australia Defence and Security Institute. He is a senior fellow at the Perth USAsia Centre and a visiting fellow at the Strategic Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Pete has been a Fulbright Fellow and Endeavour Research Scholar in the Australian United States Alliance Studies, as well as a non-resident fellow with the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies Centre at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. We're very lucky to have Pete here today because he has had extensive experience in teaching and researching strategy, military operations and Australian defence policy. He's also spent 12 years as a member of the Australian Army Reserve with postings to infantry, commando and training units. So he's somewhat of a defence insider and will be able to share his knowledge of the inner workings of the ADF with us today. Now, I did steal this part of your bio from the Dead Prussian podcast, Pete. I hope you don't mind, but I think it captures you well. In addition to strategic studies, he likes Friday burgers, cold beer, a good meme, and depressing grunge music from the 90s and early 2000s. I have it on good authority that this includes Nirvana and the Foo Fighters. So what could go wrong with those bands? I'm going to let Pete talk for around 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to chair the audience Q&A. So as we did in the first masterclass, feel free to write your question in the chat as we go through or save your question until the Q&A section. But I will just say we had a lot of questions with Richard's masterclass. So if you've got a pressing issue that you want Pete to talk to, it might be best to kind of get in early, as I'll try to go down the list during the Q&A. But let's get into it. So Peter, would you like to share your screen?
Thanks for that, Beck, and welcome everyone. I hope I'm going to be able to do something interesting. This is the second time in a couple of months that I've followed Richard Maud. I don't know what it is. I'm following him around the country. I'm stalking Morty. I have to say my career is not as illustrious as Richard Maud. I didn't get to write a foreign policy white paper and run O&I, but I'm trying in my own little way. And if I'm in any type of defence insider, I'm kind of inside out, because anyone who's been on the inside realises that it's such a complex and odd beast that no one really understands it. So the more you get involved in it, the more you realise you actually don't feel like you know anything. But I think that's with most areas that we study in life. And as for my grunge music, some people dislike it. My partner calls it my depressing old man music, is how she likes to describe it to me. So we tend to have this thing that I often wear it with headphones while I'm playing my guitar as loud as humanly possible. Anyway, we'll get on to defence policy. What I'm going to plan on doing today is give you guys a quick overview about a way to think about creating and doing defence policy, some sort of key questions and topics, a little bit about some maps and geography, because I'm a firm believer that all strategy and all defence policy and planning starts with a map of where you live. That's unavoidable, and then hopefully leave plenty of time for questions. So I've just got to find the right screen here to share and get this up and going. Just gesticulate widely there, Beck, or Kate, if you can't see it or something goes wrong. All right, So making defence policy, if we start with a blank sheet of paper and start from anew, this is a formula that I've adopted from my good friend and mentor and colleague, Hugh White. I'm sure he won't mind me using it, but in good academics terms, I've taken it and I think enhanced it and made it better than his little formula model, but he would probably tell me I've absolutely ruined it by doing what I've done with it in my own particular way. So this is basically how you do defence policy. Now, I am not a mathematician at all. This scares me even to look at it when I write it out this way, but I'll explain briefly what it is and how this means. So SE is your strategic environment. You've got to start with your strategic environment. That includes where you live, the type of countries and states around you, the international relations that you have with them, how economics works, all of those types of good things that come with strategic geography. So what is it about your strategic geography that you need to know and understand? But that environment also includes the states in that area, that regional order, the way those states interact, the types of states we have, and all that type of stuff. If you take and do an assessment of your strategic environment, and then you look at your strategic interests, what is it as a nation state that you have that are of particular strategic interests in that particular region of the world that you wish to achieve? Then what you need to do is break those strategic interests down into your strategic objectives. What are the objectives you wish your defence force to be able to achieve for you in order to achieve those strategic interests you have in the strategic environment that you live? Now, this then equals C for capability. So once you understand your strategic environment and your interest in your objectives and what you want to do with those military forces, this should tell you what types of capability or kit you should buy. And then once you've figured all that out, you should be able to figure out how much that costs and what you're going to have to spend on your defence force. Now, this is over in the first part of the diagram, all over the magic thing of R, which is risk. Fundamentally, defence policy and strategic policy is about managing risk. There's no magic number that if we spend 5% on GDP on defence or 10% that you can make yourself secure. It just doesn't work that way. What you've got to try and do is balance how much risk you're willing to accept, how much risk you want to counteract, how much risk you want to defer, and how much risk you're going to do. So the more you spend on defence, you can kind of lower your risk threshold down. You can't sort of eliminate it. But of course, that's offset against all the other things that a country likes to spend its money on, like infrastructure and hospitals and childcare and social security and infrastructure and all those things that generate the money to help carve a bit of off onto defence spending. So the more risk you're willing to accept, you can adjust the way you assess the strategic environment and your interests and your objectives and decide to buy less capability. If you're really worried about your strategic environment or think your interests and objectives are really high, are really worrisome, you can try and manage that risk or reduce that risk by spending more money and gaining more capability. So this is how, in a nutshell, you should sort of start to think about defence policy. And it tends to go in this direction, from the left to the right of the screen. The small problem is that almost every government who has done this has done it this way. That is the exact opposite. They tend to start with how much money they want to spend on defence. Then they have a debate amongst the services and the defence force and feelings about what type of bits of fancy kit they want to buy. And then they tend to find reasons to justify buying that kit by either risks or objectives or interests or the strategic environment or all of that put together. And this has become one of the complex notions of doing defence policy. So if you actually look at, for instance, the recent Australian white papers, our white papers are actually quite good in many ways in terms of we publicly declare what we're trying to do. You tend to find they start with an assessment of the strategic environment. They start to talk about what type of world we like to have and what our interests are in that world. Then they talk about the objectives that we like to achieve. So what are our defence force for? So in the current iteration of the DSU, it's shape, deter and respond. Our defence force there is to deter aggression, to shape the region and to respond with military force if need be. Then they often will talk about risk, like what type, particularly in relation to the strategic environment. So They point out the risk of major conflict is greater than it's been at any time since the sort of Second World War. We've ended the 10 years of warning time. That is, you can accept more risk when you think there's not going to be a big war for at least 10 years. Now they're saying, can't do that anymore. And their solution to that is spend more money because of the risk of war is greater and that type of stuff. They tend to often do it though back the other way. The other thing that I add into this that Hugh sort of doesn't do is this. One of the reasons it's supposed to go one way, but actually goes the other way, is because all of this exists in kind of circle called P for politics. You just can't get away from the political dimensions of strategy, which is on one hand a very good thing. As Clausewitz tells us, war, or the use of armed force, is a continuation of policy or politics by other means. So if you decide to use your military forces for whatever reason it might be, from humanitarian and disaster assistance relief through to a conventional, full-on war, you're exercising politics and you're exercising policy and you're making a political decision around that. But it is also about the politics that come along with anything that deals with that little dollar symbol on the right-hand side, which as soon as you start spending very large amounts of public money, people want to do all types of things with that money. Capability can be about jobs and industry, for instance. You build submarines in Australia because it keeps people in South Australia employed. Why? Because, well, it kept people like Christopher Pyne very happy, and he, of course, is from South Australia, but it also keeps the constituents happy, it keeps them jobs, and of course, there is 3 very marginal federal political seats in that little area clustered around the Australian Submarine Corporation and the various defence assets that sit around in South Australia. Now, doing that, however, probably means it's going to cost you to spend more money, because often building things locally is not as cheap as buying them from overseas. There is lots of other politics. There are internal politics, the politics about individual services, the politics of the Defence Department, the politics of states and those other things. So these are the things that we need to keep in mind. So if you want to kind of break it down on one slide, that's how you do defence policy. And to be honest, it doesn't matter where you are. You can be in the United States, Singapore, China, Afghanistan, or whatever, wherever you want to be. The principles are roughly, the same, except everyone has a different strategic environment, different interests, different objectives, different tolerances of risks, different political equations that they exist within, different views on capability, and different amounts of money to spend. So a few key things to think about, some principles. What is it you are trying to do and why? Now, it seems a pretty basic first principles question, but you have to actually answer, what is it that you want your military forces to do? What do you want the defence forces to do, the ADF? What is its role? Now, that seems on one hand really simple, but governments really struggle to articulate this because it's quite nefarious and it changes over time and it changes quickly. And one of the other things is that C for capability takes a very, very long time to build. We're looking at getting 8 nuclear submarines, but not till the 20s, 30s, 40s or 50s. And we don't know what the strategic environment's going to be like thereafter. Excuse me one sec. The sun's just got to that point. Now it's daylight saving. That's going right on the side of my head. We've got to remember that most of these decisions are based more on judgment than there are on hard data. You can't really quantify a lot of this stuff. You can come up with how much a frigate costs and a ship costs or a soldier costs and this, that, and the other, but it's much more difficult to say what combination of those is going to manage your interest, objectives, environment, or that risk calculation you're putting in. So this is more of an art than it is a science, or a combination of an art and a science. There's been plenty of people on the quantitative side of social sciences that Beck and Kate and I spend plenty of time on, who try and quantify these things. But, as someone who's trained also in the humanities, in history and stuff as well, like everyone who's tried has failed, right? There is no magic number of how much to spend or how many soldiers to have that will make you secure. Hopes, fears, and half-articulated ideas and attempts to predict the future are all baked into this process, right? There are some doozies out there about what people like, irrational fears and irrational ideas, but they just get so ensconced in the culture and the past and the organizational sort of culture and existence and milieu that they become almost sacred cows at times you can't contest. You know, if you talk about the US-Australian alliance, there's the ongoing debate in Australian strategic policy is that dependence upon the great power, or, you know, what level of self-reliance, not independence, but self-reliance we have. And at various times, if anyone raises that, as you know, Hugh White and others have done it, people freak out, right? Because it's like a sacred cow you can't talk about. But Hugh and others do us a great service by asking that first question. Well, why do we have the alliance and what is it supposed to do? Or why do we have this many submarines or that many submarines? These are really fundamental questions that you just got to keep asking all the time. So what is the evidence you are marshalling in order to make these decisions? And what are the arguments you are making are really key around this. What kind of forces do you want? So what is the role? What do you want the army to do? I can tell you what the army wants to do and what it likes to do, but is that what the government wants our army to do? And of course, once you decide whether do you want the army more as a peacekeeping force to be used in the South Pacific? If so, it doesn't need tanks and heavy artillery and all these types of big kit and equipment that all armies love to have. Because if you leave it up to them, they'll look around at all the other armies in the world and they're passing background and go, ooh, we want to do that. Often irrespective of what the strategic environment or the interest of the countries is, because that's what armies do. The Indonesians have Leopard 2 main battle tanks. I cannot figure out why. They will make very good roadblocks in Jakarta, but because they don't have the equipment to move them around very much, they can't really go anywhere and do anything. But armies like tanks because that's what a real army has. All types of weird things. Same with air forces, same with navies. You know, you've got to really decide what you want them to do. You also got to decide where they should be based. Now, this is an inherently political decision and inherently historically informed. As someone who spends an inordinate amount of time in Western Australia with very little of the Defence Force there except for the Navy, every Western Australian who takes a serious issue in this will tell you that a considerable portion of the Army and Navy and Air Force are in the wrong parts of Australia. If the risk is really coming out of that area to sort of the northwest of Western Australia, then why is it that everything's in Queensland, South Australia? Why is it the submarines based in Perth have to go all the way to South Australia to get repaired? It makes no sense unless you're talking about jobs and industry, history, tradition, and kind of, well, I've always been there. And of course, making decisions about moving forces around seems simple on one level, but what about all the soldiers, sailors, and airmen's families? What about our friend squadron leader Maz, who's a leader? What happens when we post her out of South Australia to Perth? What happens to her husband's job? What happens to all the other things around them and the communities and the cultures that go with it? So they're very expensive things to do and highly political from the local politics point of view. What level of readiness do you want them? Do you need your forces ready to fight now? Ready to go on the stop? If you do, great. That's going to cost you a fortune. Keeping military forces at high states of readiness is really, really expensive. And you need to have way more of them because you can't keep a soldier, sailor, or airman primed, ready to go. You can't have Michelle Smith sitting in her F-18 on the tarmac, ready to go 24 hours, 7 days a week. Michelle's going to get tired and worn out. And she has a family and she needs other training to do and she needs other jobs to do. So if you have them at low readiness, much, much cheaper, can have smaller than, but if a crisis hits you suddenly, it's going to take a long time for you to prepare and get your defence forces ready to go. So what's the balance between those two? What are your policy aims? Another simple question that's really hard to answer. How rigorously have you explored and assessed alternative options and strategies? Most defence departments and governments hate this with an unbridled passion, because their predetermined ideas and ways of doing things and their history and culture is so entrenched, they don't like it when people question them. So Defence has actually set up what they call a contestability branch. That is, people's job in Defence is to sit there and point at the services and the people who do the force design stuff and go, why are you doing that? Why haven't you done it this way? And it actually causes a fair bit of tension. But it's a good thing to have. And it's only been set up recently because what they were really worried about in Defence was a lack of contestability. That the Army would go, we want these tanks, and the Navy would go, we want these ships, and the Air Force would go, we want these planes. And they create all these elaborate scenarios and reasons justifying why they need them. And then no one was there going, yeah, but what if that's wrong? And of course, the problem with that is, as a defence outsider looking in, most of the people who work in the contestability branch used to work in the other branches who created force design, and they kind of move around inside the organisation. So the question becomes, how contestable really is it? That's why you have think tanks. That's why you have Trobe Asia, the DSI in Western Australia, the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, and all these places like the Lowy Institute and ASPI and others who all debate about these things, because often government are not good about doing it internally. And most importantly, have you done a cost-benefit analysis or looked at alternative options? So you can go for the gold-plated tank, right? You can get basically the Rolls-Royce of tanks. But what happens if you sit down and went, oh, we actually only needed a Corolla? You know, Corollas are way cheaper than the Lamborghini or the Rolls-Royce. Trust me, the Defence Forces, if given the chance, want the Rolls-Royce. They never want the Corolla. This is the role of civilian oversight and government and public accountability and stuff as well. The alignment of forces, of force plans with strategic objectives. So once you've got all these capabilities and bits of kit, is that aligned to what you want to do? Now, I would say that since the government has released the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, what it did was basically point out how redundant the current Australian Defence Force is and the types of capabilities we have. Some of them are good, some are not so good. It basically, I think, says the ADF is largely out of position. Yeah, it's often based in the wrong places. And we're looking at buying bits of equipment that really don't meet the needs, because this was a defence force designed out of the 2000 white paper and the sort of 2009 white paperish a bit, but now it's 2021. And because capability takes a long time to change, so the Army's been out buying all these armoured vehicles that look really good if you want to invade Iraq in 2003. But it's now 2021, and it wasn't a good idea to invade Iraq in 2003 in the first place, and it certainly ain't a good idea to do it in 2021. But they brought equipment that would help them design to do that. Now they're being asked by the government to look at operating in the archipelago to our north and having 70-odd ton tanks and not a lot of ways to move them around the islands, and with most of the bridges and roads in the region not built to carry that type of capability, didn't look as good as it did when you thought about buying a tank that would work really well in the Middle East. So these are some of the issues we faced. Is your funding aligned with strategy? Arthur Tang, one of the doyens of Australian strategic policy and the longest serving secretary of the department, or second longest serving secretary of the department, said, strategy without funding is not strategy. So true. So you can come up with this great strategy and idea. If the government doesn't fund it, it's pretty useless. Also, funding without strategy is just as useless. So Tony Abbott went into his period as Prime Minister on 2% of GDP of defence. And Andrew Carr and I spent a long time dismantling that argument and saying what a fallacy that is, because spending 2% of GDP wasn't going to make Australia secure. And it had no alignment with the strategic environment, the objectives, the types of capabilities. And of course, the easiest way to get to 2% of GDP in defence spending is to go into a recession and not cut defence spending. Guess what's happened? We're probably well past 2% of GDP in defence because the government hasn't stopped funding defence. But of course, the economy slowed down in COVID and as a result of a few other things. With your strategic objectives, you really must clearly articulate what you want your forces to do. Okay, capability choices must be driven by strategic objectives, and capability choices driven by strategic objectives should be cost effective. Now, I don't think I have to tell anyone here in the room that $90 billion on French-made conventional submarines was starting to look ludicrous. When ASPI did a study a few years ago saying these submarines might cost $35 million, people lost their minds. Then the government came out and said they're going to cost us $50 billion, and everyone went, what? And then, you know, in the last 12 months, we came back and went, yeah, they're going to cost us $90 billion. That's a lot of hospitals and roads and schools for things that may not turn up till 2035 or even later. Now, nuclear submarines are going to cost us more. We actually don't know what they're going to cost us. We get less of them, but I think it's the right decision. But the idea is to build them in Australia. Let's think about what's motivating that. And, you know, and a few other factors all play into this. And what it's indicative to me is the government's going, our strategic situation is so bad, we've reassessed this, that we actually really need nuclear submarines now. But they've only done that with one part of capability. They haven't done it by looking at all the rest. When they announced $270 billion worth of extra spending on defence over the next 10 years, the ADF Force Structure Plan and the IIP, the Integrated Investment Program, basically the ADF came and said, oh, we're going to have the same defence force, it's just going to be better. But the government said, oh, the strategic environment is different and deteriorating. And the ADF response is basically the same defence force with just better kit, more technologically advanced, a few more people here and there. It just seems to be like, you know, we're upgrading the family station wagon by adding roof racks and a bull bar and a few other bits and pieces, rather than going back to principles and saying, do we really need a station wagon, or do we need a four-wheel drive, or do we need a Ferrari? No one's asked that question. They've just said, oh, we've got the station wagon. You know what this station wagon needs? It needs a bull bar. And someone else has gone, it needs floodlights. And someone else goes, maybe we should lower it at the back. And then someone else said, maybe we should raise it at the front. And then someone said, maybe we should put a different carburetor on it. And all of a sudden, it's not a station wagon anymore. It's this kind of weird hybrid mess because people have just been bolting things on as they go. So this is what makes some of this stuff simple on a screen that I'm giving you, so difficult to do in practice. Risks. So ambitions and risks are limitless. Resources are finite. Always remember that. I've mentioned most of these already. Government competing priorities. Do we have public alignment and public support? What are the institutional agendas that are running here? The Defence Department is an institution. Each of the individual services, the intelligence organisations, the public service, the public servants, the politicians, the generals, the admirals, the air vice marshals. What is the culture? So past preferences and sunk costs. Defence forces are horrible at cancelling projects because they keep thinking, but we've invested so much money into it. Like, yeah, but you're willing to invest potentially another $10 billion and still get the same bad result. Industry interest. Now, defence industry is huge. They have a massive role to play. They're critical to capability, but they want to make a profit. And they want to get as much money out of the taxpayer and the government as possible, and they have their own interests. State governments have different views to local governments. When I got out of the Canberra bubble, I didn't talk about defence industry that much in my job and didn't have much interaction. Now in Western Australia, it's all about defence industry. I spend my time going to looking at ships being built and people creating widgets for things. And all state governments want to talk to you about is jobs. Defence industry jobs is what it's all about. So their priorities are a bit different to the state government. We've got a lot of reverse logic I mentioned. And of course, every dollar we spend in defence decisions is a balance of cost and benefits and opportunity costs that it's not on hospitals and roads and welfare and other stuff. Just some other things to think about very quickly. What's your strategic environment? Does it look like this? Does it look like this? Or does it look like this? If I can get my thing to work properly. What, excuse me, I can't see the top of my screen, so I can't even work. I said what I said here. Which region do you think Australia belongs to? Well, if you ask the public, we belong to Oceania, and some of us think we belong to the Indo-Pacific and the Western Asia and not part of anywhere. That's pretty disconcerting that 11% of people don't know where they are in Australia, and a bunch of people don't know. What are the threats that you see? I'm sure you could, this is a deliberately blank screen, I'm sure you could fill that with all types of threats. Now, one thing I'll tell you about strategic study scholars like myself, we like to sit in the dark and we like to drink scotch and tell you about all the bad things that are coming to get you. That's pretty much our job. We are not the happy campers of international relations. We're not the people about how, you know, the internet can liberate people and spread democracy around the world and make life better for everyone. We're the people are coming to get you. Things are coming to get you. Things are bad. This is what you can do to make them less bad. We're those people. You know, the people who sit in the dark in, you know, Chesterfield leather couches with glasses of scotch with the lights turned down, and we'll tell you everything that's wrong with the world. What threats do you see? Well, if you see, look at the Australian public, this is from the lower opinion polling. All of a sudden, around about 2020, China became a real problem for us. You know, is it an economic partner or a threat to security? From 2018, things suddenly ramped up. Look at that, from 12 to 63. That is a serious concerns the Australian public suddenly has about China from around 2018. This one you can't see, it's got the same indexes of years, the goal on the bottom. I couldn't get it to fit on one slide. This is global warming, something our current defence policy really doesn't talk about. And what I say about climate change is war with China is not inevitable, and hopefully it never happens. Climate change is inevitable. It is going to happen. You can't force structure an ADF with your little capability to solve climate change, but boy, oh boy, is the ADF going to be asked by government to undertake strategic objectives and tasks to mitigate the effects of climate change, from more disaster assistance, like we saw the ADF out of the bushfires, we saw the ADF out with COVID, to those people over there have run out of food, land, or water and are evading those other people over there to get it because of climate change. And the ADF might be told, you're going to have to go in and be peacekeeping, peace brokers, peace enforcers, or fight conflicts over those resources and those issues. That is, and the worst climate change gets, some of the modelling, if you look at the Climate Council's recent modelling on Australian security, some of it is dire. And the Defence Force will be asked to address a lot of these issues. You don't need too many F-35s and nuclear-powered submarines to do this. But what's the balance of risk between deterring China with submarines and other stuff versus different types of forces that will have to do stuff to solve climate change that may not be an existential risk, but are going to be the risks that are here and now and front of centre. This is just, so what are some other options? So we've got the defence policy we like. People have talked about armed neutrality for Australia. That's pretty much Hugh White's most recent book and what Malcolm Fraser was on about. If anyone can guess, that's a photograph of Wellington down there in the bottom corner. So we could go the New Zealand option, which is, don't have much of a defence force, hope everyone is nice to us and the rest of the world kind of mind our own business type of approach and concentrate on the South Pacific and doing what we can there. Or, another way is you go for the Fortress Australia idea. Get our own nuclear weapons, become the North Korea of the South Pacific. You'd suddenly feel probably a bit more secure about things, but probably much as you see in North Korea, no one would like you and your economy would tank as everyone puts sanctions on you, that type of stuff. Just a couple of books that I have been involved in with some colleagues of mine producing, trying to answer these very questions. There's a series of 3 books. The last one came out in 2019, The After American Primacy, and that's all about trying to figure out these big questions. What should we do about these questions and how we should sort of solve that type of stuff? Anyway, I will stop talking now, and we've got the rest of the time, the last half an hour, for questions.
Thank you.
I know that's a lot to throw at you.
No, that was brilliant. That was a terrific overview. Thank you, Pete. Remind me not to drink scotch with you in the future. That does sound very grim, but I did enjoy the car metaphors. That was very helpful. But there are a lot of questions in the chat, so I might start with Lachlan. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yep, easy. Thanks for speaking with us, Pete, as well. In the creation of defence policy, do you find there is an issue of towing the line between designating a nation as a possible threat and not offending them?
Yeah, so this is, you're talking about the intersection between diplomacy and defence policy. And I mean, if you look at, calling out, so let's use China as the example because it's the elephant in the room, right? And I can talk much easily more about China because I'm not a Defence Department official or a government official. If you notice the AUKUS announcement, you notice the Quad discussions in particular, they never mention China, right? But everyone knows there's a country starting with C and ending with A in the region, and it ain't Cambodia and it ain't Canada that they're really concerned about. So it gets to the point, so it took a long time, but it was only about 2 years ago that the United States, for instance, put out a government-endorsed document declaring that China and Russia and Iran were strategic competitors. And basically admitted what we all knew, that there is a competition, a strategic competition, an economic competition, other competitions. Our DSU was pretty frank about the strategic environment, and it said in a quite diplomatic way that the thing that's kind of driving that is strategic competition between the US and China. That's the big thing. That's the thing that's causing the end of 10 years of strategic warning time. That's why you hear the drumbeats of war comments from people like Mike Peluso. That's why the Prime Minister came up and said that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps. And obviously, I don't know if you saw how China reacted to that. They were actually pretty big steps they weren't happy. But we're kind of at the point with Chinese diplomacy now where if we sneeze, they basically, write cartoons about us and go apoplectic because it's in the realm of propaganda. It's not really serious diplomacy. But you've got to be really careful. It can be really bad. Like, George W. Bush's axis of evil, right? Like everyone was like, really? Where did that come from? Like, holy dooly, like, and suddenly the Iranians were like, what, us? Like, we know we don't have a good relationship with you, but are we part of this axis of evil too? Like, what? Where did this come from? So that can really set back, your diplomacy and international relations. So, it's probably what, Richard Maud spoke to you about last week, Morty, a little bit more on diplomacy and stuff. The left and right hand have to work together. Left hand being your diplomacy, the right hand being, it depends if you're left or right-handed. I'm left-handed, so I'd say your right hand being diplomacy, your left hand, because my left hook is better with my left hand, being your defence policy. One of the criticisms I would say I have of Australian sort of strategy writ large at the moment is the left hand, the defence hand, is getting bigger and more powerful and stronger, and this hand over here has been wilting away for years. And we're kind of looking like this rather than like this, or if anything, your diplomacy should be leading and your defence policy actually should sit underneath your broader diplomatic efforts and the broader view of the region.
Can I just ask you on that, Pete? I mean, I talk to people in the Defence Forces who actually want DFAT to be better funded because they are committed to war fighting. Like that's what, that's really what their role is. But Defence is being asked to do all of this kind of defence cooperation, defence diplomacy stuff. So I'm wondering what your view is on this.
Oh, totally. Like, when the DSU came out and the new investment program came out and we saw that, DFAT hadn't got anything. It's like, well, buy more bombs because if you don't have diplomats, you need more bombs because it's the role of the diplomats to stop the reason we need to use bombs in the first place. And it's one of the things I would say is that the government's clearly concerned about China. It's clearly concerned about the regional environment. It's concerned about a bunch of things. It's investing in defence for good reasons. But I would take some of that $270 billion and a chunk of it and give it to DFAT to increase our diplomatic footprint, increase our diplomatic missions. And as we saw from the AUKUS submarine announcement, Australian diplomacy is in a pretty bad way. The government didn't get any of the bump they wanted out of the AUKUS stuff, right? Because they ballsed up the diplomacy of it horrendously, not just with France, but with just about every country in the region, except those who are already predisposed to support us, like India and Japan and Singapore, because we already knew they thought along those lines. What we needed to do, and we didn't learn from my boss is Stephen Smith, the former defence minister. Back in his day in the Gillard government, when they announced the US Marines in Darwin, they didn't do a very good job of sorting out, Indonesia and managing that relationship really well. Now, almost a decade later, we've made exactly the same faux pas with Indonesia, right? A massive home goal. And I think part of it is a combination of DFAT's underfunded. It doesn't have the same power and strength inside government and policy circles as it used to. Basically we've got a very strong defence minister as well who overshadows our foreign minister, unfortunately. And so there's a real imbalance, I think, in the way we're doing strategy at the moment between those different areas.
And I think DFAT struggles for a constituency as well. People who are really going to defend it in the public sphere. I think that's part of the challenge as well. But Artie, you're up next. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Beck. And thanks for your time and presentation, Peter. I think going back to your mention of Quad, but also going back to the first diagram that you explained to us, my question is, with the Indian Prime Minister touted to sort of open the Sydney dialogue by ASPI later in November, what, according to you, should be the sort of 3 key focus areas with regards to the Australian-Indian defence collaboration? And then there's the second part, which is, do you think that this relationship is only just becoming important because of China and its interest in the region?
So I'll go to the last one first. I'll go in reverse order if that's okay. Look, I think the issue with China and its behaviour in the region is turbocharging that relationship. It's turbocharging the Quad, and it certainly helped drive the bilateral relationship. That's not the only reason it's important. And I would say that the Australia-India defence relationship and broader bilateral relationship has been underdone for decades. You know, it's been really problematic, and there's problems on both sides of that. You know, I mean, if you understand the adages and leftovers of the Indian public service and the Indian sort of ways of doing business, you know, we complain about our public service and its cultural and its fixed ways of doing things. The Indians give us a good run for their money, I'll tell you that much. I think what's, you know, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, obviously the border fights and issues between India and China has helped drive India closer and closer to the Quad countries. And I think that's really important. I would also argue that one of the reasons it's important is because one of the things that's been underdone in Australian defence policy, and I would say this being based in Western Australia, is the singularly lack of focus in Australian defence policy on the Indian Ocean. I'm not going to go through it now, but if you just read some statistics about trade exports from Australia through the Indian Ocean, container traffic through the Indian Ocean, have a look at a map where all of our oil comes from, and we're in one of the most oil-dependent states in the world. And if you look at the fact that the Indian Ocean, the hub of the fringe of the Indian and Pacific Oceans is where maritime Southeast Asia is. There's, you know, nearly 800 and something million people in Southeast Asia, some of our key top trading partners, and huge amounts of interest for it. That's been underdone for ages. Now, it doesn't mean I don't agree with the Pacific Step Up, for instance, but in stark strategic terms, there's about 7.5 million people in the South Pacific. Right, the levels of trade and volume and trade that happen there are pretty small. And if you looked at my other map on the Australia-India land bridge map, if you slightly tilt Australia this way, you realise the South Pacific and New Zealand are about as far away humanly possible from Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and China and India as you can get. The majority of our trade, the majority of our investment, and I think the majority of our need for diplomatic effort sits in Southeast Asia, which includes the Indian Ocean, right? You know, most of the Southeast Asian states, a lot of them are Indian Ocean states as well. That's what should be driving our relationship with India. They've had a look East policy and an act East policy for a very long period of time. It's taken this kind of issue with China to try to get us together to do stuff. What should we focus on that? Well, you got to crawl before you walk and you run. So we've got to do just more basic, you know, military exercises. HADR exercises, even cruising around the ocean next to each other so we get the idea, more people-to-people exchanges so we understand the culture and how things interact and respond. More discussions on a staff level about what's areas of mutual collaboration and mutual interests and how we can value add to each other's interest in the region. So, you know, we've got Cocos and Keeling Islands, which are amazing strategic assets in the Indian Ocean. We've done a bit of defence investment in it. An easy way could be, well, let's allow the Indian P-8 aircraft that we have that are the same as ours to land there and refuel. That would give them extended range in the region. It would be a nice way to cooperate. You know, some really simple things like that is what we've got to start with. But we've also got to have conversations knowing where our interests diverge. You know, we're not about to send military forces to go into Kashmir or the line of control between, you know, India and China and help fight, you know, the Indians on that thing. That's just not going to happen. You know, they're probably not going to send ships and naval and air assets into the South Pacific to help us if something's going to happen. We got to work on what those areas are. But there's a lot more. You know, we have a keen interest in Indian Ocean maritime security. We have a keen interest in economic relations in the Indian Ocean. And of course, there's 1.1 billion people in India. The Chinese population is shrinking. In the next 30 to 50 years, their population is going to drop by tens of millions of people. The Indian population is young. Their economy is growing. Yes, they've got issues, but it's also a dynamic economic and other partnership for us to work on.
Yeah, great question and great response. Nicholas, you've got a question?
Good evening, Beck and Pete, both of you. My question is, as a strong consideration of the next 20 years, could you talk about the Australia-Japan relationship, in particular, Japanese defensive capability and what the Australian Defence Society would like to see Japan develop more or put more of a focus on, particularly in the light of recent developments of their new Prime Minister and arguments raised by potential Prime Ministerial candidates about missiles hosted by the United States, or hosted on behalf of the United States, rather. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation as well.
No problem. Great question. really interesting, the US, the Australia-Japan relationship. On one level, you know, doesn't seem to work, right? You know, they've got a particular constitution, they've got an existential threat not far from them in North Korea, they've got a major threat in terms of their relationship with China, and then we're down the other end of Asia. And if anything happens in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, is there any chance that Japanese self-defense forces will come and help us? I think there's about this much chance, right? However, do we have an interest and stake in regional stability in East Asia? Absolutely. That is absolutely critical and key to the prosperity of the region, to our future prosperity and the regional order and safety and security and defense. We're both allies of the United States. In one sense, you're really looking at, what you're looking at in Japan is the northern anchor of the US alliance. I mean, they've got South Korea as well, right? But Japan's a major power. South Korea is a middle power like us. And we're the southern anchor of the US alliance system in Asia. We are geographically important for both reasons, but we have differences. So you've seen various prime ministers, Tony Abbott, John Howard, and others who have tried to drive a much closer defense and strategic relationship with Japan. But it does have these constraints. It has the constraints about the Japanese constitution. It has constraints about, you know, how they will potentially use their forces and the types of things that they do. They have a very, very capable defense force, and they're also got a defense force that's, you know, going through all those things that we've been discussing and reposturing and reshaping itself. And you know, its army's gone about a fundamental reorganization to face the issues around the Senkaku Islands and the potential of conflict with China and all that type of stuff. And it's gone through a very difficult process. It's still going through to try and reform and reshape all of that type of stuff. So trilaterally, I think there's a lot of stuff we can do with the United States there. They are a major power in Asia. They're going to be absolutely critical in things like the Quad and in broader balancing and in regional multilateral forums. We're going to have a very close and should have a very close relationship with Japan. But on the hard power sense, the key question is, where are those limits? What are we willing to do if the balloon goes up to support the Japanese? What are they willing to do to support us? And probably most important for both of us is, what will we do over something like Taiwan, which is kind of at the intersection of both of us, and we're allies of the United States, and how do we respond to those questions as well? So it's a relationship to continue to watch. It's been evolving very slowly, but very steadily in a direction of deeper collaboration and cooperation. And I think that will continue into the future.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more rapid than that, in a sense that it was only the 80s when we really considered Japan to still be a bit of a threat to regional order. And in some ways, you know, Japan was seen in the same way that we see China now, maybe not quite to the same extent, but so
well, economically, yes, I'd agree with you. Economically, everyone was worried that that would, you know, overtake the United States and be the big power in Asia.
Yeah. So it's interesting how far we actually have come over a relatively short amount of time, if we think of the, you know, span of history. But Jamie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thanks, Peter, again for a great presentation. My question's probably, I probably wrote it a little bit prematurely. It's probably changed a little bit. But
change away.
You speak about the challenges, the very well documented challenges to building a defence force, in particular timing with ASDEFCON and how slowly that goes, but then also with the the pressure that AIC puts and politicians really being interested in building local jobs, which seemingly impacts international relations as well. Buying things off strategic partners such as Korea or Israel would seemingly be a good thing for international relations, right? But and I did ask this before you put up your 3 books, which I'll have to get my hands on. But basically, if I can just ask you to sort of give us a little bit of an overview of what actually is a little bit of what would a better, a quicker and less politicized sort of defense industry capability look like, which would more readily suit our rapidly changing strategic interests.
Yeah, so I'll have a stab, but I'm not sure I can actually answer your question. If you look at defense, it's done God knows how many reviews on that very question, right? And it seems to have a lot of reviews that shit on shelves and don't go anywhere, or reviews where they change everything and the outcome seems to be exactly the same. And we're having, Melissa Price has launched yet another investigation into defence industry policy and particularly procurement policy. And one of the great advantages of being out in Western Australia and the States is I talk to a lot of defence industry people, and you could cynically look at defence industry and say they're about making money, right? And they do make a lot of profit and a lot of money. But at the same time, particularly the small to medium enterprises, they're really committed to the mission. Like, they really want to contribute to the national endeavour, right? They see it as a core part of some of the things that they want to do, and they're very passionate and committed about it, and they're very frustrated by the processes, right? And I think one of the issues we're facing at the moment is defence procurement and defence capability development has traditionally been very long-term thinking, right? So Kim Beazley decides we're going to get new submarines. He decides we're going to build them in Australia, and he decides that we're going to get Collins-class submarines. And 20-something years later, the last one is delivered, right? That's a long time. And we're facing a similar kind of submarine conundrum. The difference is in 1984, when Kim did this, and I know Kim really well, and he's the governor of my state I live in, and I speak to him about this all the time because he loves a chat. The strategic environment was pretty much completely benign. Like the Cold War was at its height, right? But its center of gravity was in Europe, like about as far away from us as humanly possible. And then within 5 years, the Berlin Wall had fallen down, communism had ended, we were in the unipolar moment. And of course, we continue to build submarines because you never know what the future is going to be like. But we've had this big, long period of time. Now, if you look at current defence policy, we're saying that time scale is done and dusted. And you have things like Army, the Chief of Army has got a really interesting document, what he calls accelerated warfare, about how geopolitics is accelerated, technology is accelerated, all these other things. So we've got to accelerate our thinking, the way we behave. And I've kept saying is we've got accelerated warfare as a paradigm we're dealing with, and we've got Australian procurement processes that are stuck in circa 1980 ways of spending public money, right? So what the defence officials and politicians and people like myself and Beck and others are talking about who analyse this stuff is rapidly changing environment, things that are moving really quickly, massive technological change, need to respond quickly. And the risk issue is real. The people who do procurement and spend your taxpayers' dollars, right, do it on a public money spending basis that's not designed to do anything quickly, right, in order to protect, your taxpayers' dollars as best they can. So their tolerance for risk is about this much, right? Where over here, the people are saying the tolerance for risk is through the roof. So it's another issue that we've got. So what we've got to try and do is reconcile how can we do those things. And the other competing things is if we get these submarines built overseas, right, they're going to come much, much quicker than the Australian jobs miss out. So as some people argue, do you want the capability or do you want a national industry policy? Because the two things are starting to diverge now. Then the other problem I'll say to you is much better idea to go and get these things and buy them from overseas. Small problem. The Americans and the British can't build submarines quick enough for their own navies. They literally have got no spare capacity at the moment. So we either convince them to build things more quickly and give us some, or we've got to figure out how to do it rapidly ourselves. And then there's a potential hybrid model. Maybe we can lease or borrow or buy boats from overseas and then build the last couple here. But it's about balancing those interests up. And so what people will say is, if you don't build things in Australia, you run the fundamental risk we did in the late 1930s, when you suddenly decide you need to rearm and ramp up and you have no defence industry in Australia and everybody else is doing the same thing in the world, there's no spare leftovers for us. The reason we've got a car industry and an aircraft industry in Australia and a shipbuilding industry in Australia is in the Second World War, no one would sell us that stuff, not because they didn't think we should have it, is because they couldn't build enough of their own. So we had to create those industries in the Second World War and build them for ourselves. That's why the government's looking at some sovereign capability. So it's balanced. They're trying to say what sovereign things we need: missiles. So we need to develop our own missiles, a long-term shipbuilding program, not so much aircraft, not so much this. So they're trying to ascertain which is the key pieces of kit you've got to have and build here, and which are the ones you can buy overseas. And so it's actually really hard to do. I would say on some projects, you just got to give up on national industry policy. When we lost the car sector, right, and the car subsidies, which I don't think was a bad thing, but the government didn't have a national industry policy for Australia. So we basically created one out of defence industry. But the problem is it's still not a national industry policy. It's still only a defence industry policy. So now you get the collision of national industry policy against defence capability. So I've probably given you more problems and more issues than I have answers. But hey, I'm going to claim that that's what we do as analysts and academics and cynics.
Yeah, that's right. We explain
I'm not a
all of the problems.
I'm a policy critic, not a policy maker.
Yes, that's our role here. Tom, would you like to ask your question?
Cheers, Beck, and thanks, Peter, for the talk. That was really interesting. My question is, what are the key differences between authoritarian and democratic defence policy formulation? I mean, I guess it's a bit hard to gauge opaque systems like China and Russia, although the AUKUS announcement, like you said, wasn't exactly transparent. But it seems like defence policy is kind of universally a top-down approach, and obviously democracies are more accountable in their decisions to the citizens and things like that. But defence policy doesn't really seem to figure too much in debates outside of like defence policy wonk circles. And then the general public even seem willing to accept decisions relatively uncritically, like even in a lot of cases, decisions to go to war and things like that. So I was just wondering, what you think that the main differences are.
Look, the fundamental issues I spoke about are the same. It doesn't matter if you're an authoritarian state, you're the Taliban, you know, the People's Republic of China, you're North Korea, you're whoever. Those kind of principles I started at the beginning of the talk are roughly similar. The pressures and politics are just different, right? If you look and to use another authoritarian state, you look at Nazi Germany. There's been so much written about Nazi Germany, and particularly their defence forces, right? And I started my life as a Second World War historian before I got into more contemporary politics stuff. And, you know, I'm one of these people with that odd fascination with that place called Europe sometimes and the war they kind of fought and, you know, studying Nazi stuff and everything, but I can't speak German, so it could never be a real career. But if you look at all the deep studies in that, it's a completely dysfunctional state, right? And the inter-service rivalry were even worse than they were in the democracy. Now, if you look at the way the US developed in the Second World War, they're really bad, right? Really bad. Until you look at the other guys, and they're just worse. Right? The same, you know, because it's about playing people off against each other. You get the same factionalisms, but more intense. The stakes often can be higher because people get put in gulags or executed. You know, look at Stalin, for instance. You know, he committed purges in 1937, 1938 of his military because he was worried about a military coup. He pretty much killed off anyone who had a brain in the Soviet military, right? So by the time the Germans invaded, like, he was lucky he just had a vast interior to and was willing to take enormous casualties and people's loss of life to rebuild his military in the middle of a war, because he got rid of all the people who knew what they were doing because he saw them as a threat to the state. So it's more opaque, but they have the same issues, and often they're supplanted on even bigger levels. On the outside, sometimes it can look like they're being more decisive, right? Because Xi Jinping can go, this is what we're going to do, or you know, Kim Jong-un can say, this is what we're going to do. But when you look underneath that, the power is diffused in all types of different ways. And when you centralize that power too much, what we've found from studies of military modernization over different countries, over different decades in different areas, is you stifle innovation. And if you stifle people's ability to question things and you stifle innovation, you don't get change. You get caught in paradigms that you can't get out of. Now, that can happen in democratic, free and open societies and stuff as much as it can in others. And it often comes down to the military, but it tends to be that democracies are better because they're more accountable, right? Because the people and other politicians can go to question time and ask really uncomfortable questions. You know, the amount of defence procurement waste, I'm sure, that happens in China and Russia would dwarf what happens in Australia and the United States and Japan, because there's no, you know, journalists doing investigations in this stuff. There's not, defence industry has the ability here to mouth off in the media, where they can't do that in these authoritarian states. So it's a part of that mirage they often do, these authoritarian states, are making it look more central and direct and organised and controlled, but it's just as chaotic inside, often worse in terms of inside. And those, you know, pressures of politics, procurement, industry policy, jobs, you know, all play out on those same states as well.
Now, Peter, we're on 7, but I'm wondering whether you would be happy to take just 2 more questions.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Hisham, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Beck. Yeah, this was just a general question. I was just wondering what sort of security threats we have in the current environment, and whether we have any policies or capabilities to handle such a major conflict.
Sorry, I missed the first part of it. Is that?
Yeah, whether we have any sort of security threats, and if so, whether we have capabilities and policies in place to handle such a scenario.
So the best thing is to look at that is go and have a look at the 2020 Defence Strategic Update. That is the government basically declaring to the public, to the state, this is its justification for why we spend the billions of dollars every year and every day. I think it's about $1 billion a day, I think we spend on just keeping the Defence Force running. That's their public document to say what they're concerned about. You know, are we spending the right amount of money? Probably, you know, probably there. I don't think we're necessarily spending it on the right things. The threats, we're clearly worried about the regional order, right? Some fundamental things have changed in the last few years. And a lot of it is about China that we mentioned. You know, we used to live in this lovely paradise here in the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean at the bottom of Asia and go, oh, isn't the world great? Our favourite friend and ally of the United States is the uncontested hegemon of the region. And they're a reasonably benign hegemon. Like, you know, you can pick on them for a whole bunch of things, but as hegemons go in world history, they're pretty good. And they're certainly aligned with us. And they like things like democracy, well, they used to, the rules-based international order, open and free trade, all this type of stuff that we loved, right? The last sort of couple of decades, we've seen the rise of China. What Australia's always worried about is the rise of another major power to become the hegemon of Asia that is not our friend and ally, because that is a very risky environment for us. That's what's freaking us out, right? We're probably at the point where we're all willing to go, look, we're willing to accept a balance of power in the region where no one side has the upper hand, right? It's much more dicey and hard to keep a thing on limbo, but we just don't want someone else. Now, we didn't want Japan to be that hegemon. We don't want China to be that hegemon. You know, we don't pretty much want anyone else, but we can live with a balance of power. So we're really concerned about that. In the past, when we weren't worried about that, we could be worried about more about terrorism and what's happening, you know, in different parts of the world. But now we have to be much more worried about our local region. It's not benign like it used to be. So the government's focused on that. What's the role of the Defence Force? Well, the first thing is to deter. So as a middle power, I think we need to be responsible to a level degree for our own defence and be a responsible stakeholder into the region. You have to do that by good diplomacy, good economic engagement, but you also need to, you know, was it Teddy Roosevelt said, you know, walk quietly, carry a big stick, right? If you don't have a credible defence force and a credible deterrent capability, you can be pushed around, coerced and intimidated by other states in the international system. That's what we don't want to do. What concerns me about that DSU is there is one mention of climate change and one mention alone. And it's kind of this wishy-washy, oh, climate change might cause some concerns, you know?
So, Pete, can I jump in there? Because Catherine's last question is on climate change.
Yep. Nice, good segue.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm glad you mentioned that, Beck. Thank you. I kind of wanted to end it on an optimistic note. We have much discourse and empirical evidence on climate change. And you've also mentioned that it's a little somewhat disappointing that the defence policy doesn't necessarily, I guess, promote climate change action. So
I'd say extraordinarily disappointing.
Okay, your words, okay, yeah. I was just wondering, how can defence policy address climate change? What are some of the key kind of mitigation adaptation plans we can have through defence policy, they'll address things like natural disasters, food insecurity, not just for Australia, but also our Pacific partners who are really eyeing Australia for help right now, like places like Kiribati, Indonesia, and such. So I'm wondering to hear what your thoughts are on this.
So this comes back to, and this is really playing into some of the key balancing act in your capability and the types and style and balance of defence forces that you have. You can have a defence force, as Hugh White would tell us, that is aimed at independently deterring China or any other major power from coercing us. That means lots of investments in F-35s, submarines in particular, like he wants 24 conventional submarines, you know, all this stuff. He's singularly focused on that's our most important issue. So you design the whole defense force around that and you focus on that. Now, if we go to war with China, that is a very, very high risk, potentially existential threat to the country. The chances of that happening, I think, are quite low. But on the other side, we know climate change is real and it's happening and the effects are going to happen. So the Defence Force is going to be asked to do more and more in relative to climate change. Now, on one level, that's an existential threat to the whole globe and everything. But in terms of Australia's national security, immediate national security and sovereignty, it's a reasonably low risk, right? But it is definitely going to happen. So do you structure for the thing that may never happen, but is an existential threat? Or do you force structure for the thing you know is going to happen, but is not so much of a national sovereignty sort of risk, if you know what I mean? Or where do you have it balanced somewhere in between? The way our Defence Force has done it is we've got what they call a balanced force, right? So we have submarines, we have fighter jets, we have frigates, we have things that are war-like, but then we have a whole bunch of capabilities like C-17 transport aircraft, like lots of, a fair number of soldiers who can go around and help fight bushfires. We have landing helicopter dock ships that can be used for war stuff, but are even better when you use them, like, as we saw off the bushfires to evacuate people, or in tsunamis or in floods. Do we have lots of engineers in our army designed with equipment that can help go in and do stuff in natural disasters? Or do we have more tanks, designed to fight wars and deter people? This is the fundamental balance that you got to look at in relation to that question. What can they do? Well, first of all, the Defence Force is a major consumer of fossil fuels and a major consumer and an additive to climate change issues. So what they are doing, but they probably need to do much faster and much quicker, is how do we go to more renewable energy, which actually has strategic advantages. I spent time in the army. Every time you go out bush in the army and there's a big headquarters, we'd all stand around and laugh. You just got to go listen for the generators, right? Because I was an infantry guy, all the POGs, the guys who are rear echelon guys and the supply people, they can't live without their tents and their generators and their trucks, right? So they've got big heat signatures, big signatures of a lot. If you turn them green, if they're using solar energy and renewable energy, you don't have that mass generator noise. They're actually more silent. They're more, can help them to achieve their tactical outcomes and that type of stuff as well. Then you also need to look at, as I said, you can't force structure the ADF to solve climate change. The government needs an integrated national policy approach to energy policy, to economics and to other things. But they're going to have to figure out how much of the ADF they want structured to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And the real risk, besides sort of China and strategic order in the region over the next, I think, 20 to 30 years, as I said before, what happens when water and land and other resources become very, very scarce in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia? In the past, throughout the entire course of human history, when those things have become scarce, people use force to get it, to protect their own people, their own families, their own communities, their own societies. There is, I think, a real risk in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years that you could end up with low-level conflict throughout our region as different groups, countries, even states, clans, tribes, family groups or whatever, start using force to compete for those resources. And we've got to think through, how can we use our military forces to deter that and hopefully stop it from happening? Or how can we help use the Defence Force as one part of our policy arm, along with diplomacy and economics and stuff to do things like peacekeeping and peace enforcement and other things into the region as well. So the ADF has a role to play in part of a much bigger government policy. And what I have to say is, I saw a chart a friend of mine, Wesley Morgan, put up, who's a guy from Griffith University who works on climate change issues and security and stuff. He put on Twitter this chart that for this global conference coming up, it was like this: every country in the world on the chart. Over here, the people doing the best on climate change. Over there, the people in the worst. We were third from the bottom over here, along with China, right? As in the worst performers in dealing with climate change and stuff. Yes, we're a small country and a big thing, but we're a massive polluter, and I think we're just not carrying our weight. And most importantly, if you really think climate change is an issue, an existential issue, and you think it's got security implications, you need an integrated whole of government strategy to deal with that. And the ADF has to have a role in its part. And if you believe the media reports in the last 12 months, those people, the public servants and military officials in defence who raise this, are being told by government they're not allowed to talk about it.
Wow. That's a really interesting place for us to end our conversation. But we have taken, we've gone 10 minutes over time. So really grateful, Pete, for your time, for coming along and having a chat with us. That was a really excellent discussion about defence policy. We have a session on Friday. This is a kind of casual session that we've organised with Susanna Patton and Caitlin Gauchi. You will have seen the email.
They're both very good, by the way.
They're very good.
Very good people. I was on a panel with Susan the other day. She's awesome.
We're having Friday afternoon drinks with Susanna.
If you remember my bio, bring your burgers with you and your beers. That's what I do. I've been in lockdown. On every Friday, my friends from all around the country, we have a little Friday booze group. You get a hamburger and you get a beer and you have a chat.
Or you watch your existential crises.
Yeah.
That's before the scotch and the dark room.
Yeah, before the darkness comes. When we talk about the nice things like your family and your kids and your friends and all the happy stuff in life.
That's right. So that's happening on Friday afternoon. So if you can make it, it'll be great. We're just going to talk about careers, and as Peter said, they're terrific experts and just really great people. So we're excited that they were willing to come along and share their experiences. But once again, Peter, it's been terrific having you along. Really, I've learned a lot. And I'm sure that everybody else here has as well. So thank you.
You asked me to talk about my favourite topic.
It's an endlessly fascinating topic too. So thank you. And thank you to all of our participants for the excellent questions. Again, really phenomenal, insightful questions have been posed today, and hopefully see you on Friday. But we will end the session now.